The tank driver who fought Hitler in reverse, and won twice. June the 6th, 1944. Normandy, France, 3:47 p.m. The Sherman tank sat motionless in a field of shattered hedgerow, its engine idling low, barely audible over the distant rumble of artillery. Inside, Private Joe Johnson gripped the gear lever with hands slick from sweat and oil. The air smelled like burning rubber and spent brass. Through the narrow periscope slit, he could see nothing but smoke and the jagged silhouettes of trees torn apart by shell fire. Then came the sound, a deep, mechanical growl that seemed to vibrate through the earth itself, rhythmic and relentless, like the breath of something ancient and angry. His loader whispered the word everyone feared: Tiger. Before we go further, hit that like button if you're watching from anywhere in the world. Seriously, where are you right now? New York? Mumbai? São Paulo? It's wild that we're all here together, across continents and time zones, connected by history. Drop your location in the comments. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You don't want to miss what happens next. Because what Joe Johnson did in the next 10 minutes would become one of the most unorthodox and daring tank maneuvers in World War II history. And in that moment, staring into the fog, he realized something no training manual had ever taught him. To survive, he'd have to do the one thing no one expected: drive backward into the fight. Joe Johnson wasn't supposed to be a hero. Born in 1922 in Seward County, Nebraska, he grew up fixing tractors with his father on a farm that stretched flat and endless under big prairie skies. He learned to drive before he turned 12, reversing John Deere machines through narrow barn doors without scratching the paint. His father used to say, "The trick to backing up isn't looking behind you, it's knowing where you came from." Joe never forgot that. When he enlisted in the summer of 1942, he was tall but wiry, quiet in a way that made sergeants nervous. He didn't drink much, didn't gamble, didn't talk about glory. He just wanted to bring his crew home alive. During training at Fort Benning, Georgia, the other tankers started calling him Backtrack Joe. It wasn't a compliment. Every drill, every exercise, Joe would reverse his Sherman out of ambush zones instead of charging forward. The instructors hated it. One sergeant screamed at him during a live fire exercise, "Johnson, you gonna win the war driving backwards?" Joe didn't answer. He just kept doing it. On weekends, when the other guys went into town, Joe would sneak back to the motor pool and practice reversing down gravel roads, learning to read terrain through mirrors, learning to feel the weight of 30 tons shifting in reverse. To most of the unit, it looked like cowardice. And maybe, in some small way, it was. But Joe wasn't afraid of dying. He was afraid of dying stupid. By the time his unit shipped out to England in May 1944, Joe had studied everything he could find on German armor. He knew the Tiger tank weighed 57 tons and carried an 88mm gun that could punch through a Sherman's frontal armor from over a mile away. He knew it had thick steel plating that shrugged off most Allied shells. But he also knew its weaknesses. The rear armor was thinner. The engine deck was vulnerable. The turret ring could jam if hit at the right angle. Joe memorized these details like scripture. He drew diagrams in the margins of his field manual. He thought about them in his sleep, but he never talked about it. He just waited. The Normandy landings changed everything. By June 9th, 3 days after D-Day, Joe's unit had pushed inland from Omaha Beach into the bocage, the dense hedgerow country of northern France. The terrain was a nightmare for tanks. Narrow lanes boxed in by ancient stone walls, fields divided by thick vegetation that could hide an entire panzer division. Visibility was rarely more than 50 feet. Radio contact was spotty. Commanders were making decisions blind. Joe's platoon, 4 Shermans and a half-track, had been ordered to link up with a Canadian column near the town of Caumont. But the road had collapsed under artillery fire, and now they sat exposed in a clearing, waiting for orders that never came. That's when the first shell hit. It came without warning, a streak of fire that tore through the Sherman on their left flank. The tank, call sign Red 5, exploded in a fountain of flame and shrapnel. The crew inside never had time to scream. The shockwave slammed into Joe's hull, rattling his teeth and filling the compartment with acrid smoke. His gunner, Ellis, cursed under his breath. His loader, Mitch, shouted, "Tiger! That's a goddamn tiger!" Joe didn't need confirmation. He knew that sound. He'd been expecting it. Through the periscope, he saw it. A massive silhouette emerging from the fog like a predator stepping into firelight. The tiger's long gun barrel swept slowly from left to right, hunting. Its tracks churned mud and grass as it crept forward, patient and methodical. Joe's crew was panicking. Ellis screamed, "We gotta move, Joe! Forward now!" Mitch was already reaching for the hatch, ready to bail. The tank commander sat frozen, staring at the monster in front of them. Every instinct said run. Every doctrine said retreat. But Joe didn't move forward. He threw the gear lever into reverse. The Sherman lurched backward, its tracks biting into the muddy slope. The crew shouted in disbelief. "What the hell are you doing?" Mitch yelled. Joe didn't answer. He kept his eyes on the mirrors, watching the terrain behind him, feeling the slope under the treads. Another German shell screamed past and exploded just ahead of where they'd been seconds earlier. The blast sprayed dirt across the periscope, but Joe held steady. He was thinking 3 moves ahead. The Tiger crew expected them to run forward or freeze. They didn't expect a retreat that wasn't really a retreat. Joe was repositioning. He was baiting. He guided the Sherman backward down a shallow embankment, using the wreckage of Red 5 as cover. The Tiger followed, creeping forward onto the slope, its gun depressed to maintain line of sight. The German commander was confident. Why wouldn't he be? Tigers were invincible. Shermans were coffins. But in following Joe, the Tiger exposed its weakness. As it crested the ridge, its rear undercarriage came into view just for a moment, just enough. Joe slammed the brakes. "Stop!" he barked. The tank shuddered to a halt. "Turret left, armor piercing, fire now!" Ellis swung the gun. Mitch loaded. The cannon roared. The shell hit the Tiger's rear engine deck and detonated. Flames erupted from the seams. The German tank convulsed, then exploded as its ammunition cooked off in a chain reaction. Fire rolled through the hedgerow, scattering debris and scorching the earth. Inside Joe's Sherman, no one spoke. They just stared at the burning wreck. Mitch finally broke the silence. "Did we just kill a tiger?" Ellis nodded slowly, his hands still shaking on the gun controls. Joe exhaled. "Reload," he said quietly. "We're not done yet." Word spread fast. Within an hour, other units were crackling over the radio asking for confirmation. A Sherman killed a tiger? In reverse? Officers didn't believe it until they saw the wreckage. By nightfall, the story had mutated into legend. Some said Joe had driven backward for half a mile. Others said he'd destroyed 3 tigers. The truth didn't matter. What mattered was that the myth of the tiger's invincibility had cracked. Joe didn't care about the talk. He was thinking about the second one. Because intelligence reports said there were 2 tigers operating in the sector, and the other one was still out there. The next morning, Joe's unit was ordered to support a Canadian column pinned down along a valley road. German artillery had turned the route into a killing field. The Canadians couldn't advance and couldn't retreat. They were trapped. And holding the high ground, invisible in the mist, was the second tiger. Joe studied the map with his lieutenant, a wiry Texan named Keating who'd stopped questioning Joe's tactics after the first kill. "There's a ridge here," Joe said, pointing. "If we loop through this orchard and come down the back slope in reverse, we can flank it." Keating stared at him. "You want to back into another tiger?" Joe nodded. "That's where the advantage is." They moved out at dawn. The orchard was scorched from previous shelling, its trees blackened and twisted. Smoke hung between the trunks like a curtain. Joe guided the Sherman through carefully, engine low, treads muffled by soft earth. When they reached the ridge, he shifted into reverse and began the descent. Slow, controlled, every meter calculated. Through the periscope, he saw the Tiger below, angled toward the valley, its gun trained on the stalled convoy. It hadn't seen them yet. Joe kept backing down, using the terrain for cover, waiting for the perfect moment. His crew was silent. Every man knew this was life or death. The Tiger fired at the Canadians. The blast echoed across the valley. Joe saw the flash, saw the turret recoil, saw the German crew reloading. And in that instant, the Tiger's rear quarter turned just enough. "Fire," Joe said. The cannon thundered. The shell punched through the Tiger's rear armor and exploded inside. Flames erupted from the engine compartment. But the Tiger didn't die. It shuddered, turned, and began to pivot its turret toward them. The crew inside was still alive, still fighting. Joe's heart hammered. "Reload! Armor-piercing! Now!" Mitch slammed another shell into the breach. Ellis cranked the turret. The Tiger's gun was swinging toward them, slow but unstoppable. Joe held his breath. "Fire!" The second shot hit lower between the turret and hull. This time, the Tiger came apart. The turret lifted off like a hatbox blown by wind. Flames belched from every seam. Ammunition inside detonated in a cascading roar. The tank collapsed onto its side, a burning carcass. Joe's crew sat in stunned silence. 2 Tigers, both dead, both killed in reverse. Then the world exploded. An unseen artillery shell landed 10 feet from their left tread. The blast lifted the Sherman off its suspension. Light, sound, and heat slammed into the crew like a fist. Joe's head cracked against the viewport. His ears rang. His vision blurred. He felt something warm and wet spreading across his ribs. Blood. A piece of shrapnel had punched through the hull and embedded itself just below his vest. Deep. He looked down at the wound, then at his hands still gripping the controls. He didn't feel pain, just cold. Ellis was shouting, but Joe couldn't hear him. Mitch was on the radio screaming for a medic. Joe slumped back in his seat, breathing shallow. Outside, the second Tiger burned. Beyond it, the Canadian convoy was moving again. They were safe. 37 men would make it home because of what Joe had done. He smiled faintly. Ellis leaned down, grabbing his shoulder. "Joe, stay with me. You hear me? Don't you dare check out now." Joe blinked slowly. His voice was a whisper. "Tell command. Objective secured." Mitch's voice cracked. "Medic's on the way. Just hold on." But Joe was already somewhere else. The roar of engines faded. The smoke thinned. He saw Nebraska again. Wheat fields under summer sun. His father's hands on a tractor wheel. The smell of diesel and fresh earth. He whispered one last sentence. "Tell my mom I didn't back down. I backed them up." His hand slipped from the gear lever. His eyes closed. The engine coughed once, then died. For a long moment, the only sound was wind moving through the shattered trees. Canadian medics arrived minutes later. They found 2 shaken soldiers and 1 fallen driver. They covered Joe with a tarp and marked his name on the tank with chalk. Private Joseph R. Johnson, killed in action. That night, as the smoke settled over Normandy, Ellis wrote in his notebook words no one would read for years. "He never looked like a hero. He just refused to let us die. He didn't retreat. He reversed the odds." Joe was buried 2 weeks later beneath an apple tree near Caumont. No grand ceremony, no reporters. Just a wooden cross and a helmet resting at its base. But word of what he'd done spread like wildfire. Tankers across the front began practicing what they called reverser drills, backing into ambush positions, using smoke and terrain to bait enemy armor into exposing weak points. In official manuals, no one mentioned Joe's name, but among the men he became shorthand for a kind of thinking, bold, unorthodox, desperate but deliberate, the kind of thinking that saves lives. The War Department posthumously awarded him the Silver Star. The citation read, "For extraordinary tactical improvisation under direct enemy fire." His mother received the medal in a small ceremony in Nebraska. She wept, holding the ribbon in hands that smelled like flower and lavender. She never understood how her son, the boy who fixed tractors and hated loud noises, had become a legend. But she knew he'd been brave. Not because he charged forward, but because he knew when to turn around. After the war, a group of veterans returned to that ridge and replaced Joe's wooden cross with a stone marker. Carved into the granite were 3 lines. Private Joseph R. Johnson. He did not retreat. He reversed the odds. Once a year, on the anniversary of the breakout from Normandy, a Canadian veteran would visit. He'd bring a bottle of bourbon and place it on the stone. Then he'd sit in silence, because he knew what the reports didn't say. Joe didn't just stop a tiger. He stopped fear from winning. Most war stories end with medals or memorials. They conclude with a clean sense of closure, the hero either receiving an ovation or being enshrined in marble. But this one ends differently, not with a flourish of trumpets, but on a silent, overgrown slope in Normandy, where a rusted Sherman tank still sits beneath the weeds, its metal carcass frozen in time. Its treads are locked in place, pointed not toward glory, but emphatically away from it, backward. This silent testament is Joe Johnson's final enduring statement. Joe Johnson didn't live to write memoirs. He didn't come home to tell his story in smoky halls to hushed crowds, and no studio executive would ever have made his fight into a blockbuster. What he left was infinitely more valuable than fame, a trail of decisions no one else dared to make. He bequeathed a strategy no manual ever taught, a piece of wisdom hammered out not in a classroom, but under the terrifying hammer blows of an 88mm cannon. It was a single, impossible moment where every fiber of training, every flicker of animal instinct, every pulse of fear said run, and instead he stood firm by deliberately turning around. It was reckless. It was, by all conventional standards of combat, maybe even suicidal. Yet it worked. Not because he was lucky, not because his Sherman was stronger than the mighty tiger, but because he saw what others, blinded by doctrine and fear, couldn't. He understood that the surest way to advance the line and save lives was to momentarily, tactically, retreat. His courage was the courage of the architect, not the berserker. That is the profound, unsettling lesson of Backtrack Joe. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do is not charge ahead. Sometimes heroism doesn't sound like a battle cry. It sounds like the high-pitched grinding gears of a 30-ton machine shifting into reverse. Sometimes saving 37 lives looks absolutely nothing like a Hollywood charge. It looks like a dusty Nebraska farm boy, driving backward down a muddy slope, watching the terrain through a tiny mirror. And sometimes the man you mocked and laughed at during training, the quiet one, the one who looked like a coward, becomes the name you whisper in the dark, smoky confines of a tank when everything goes pitch black and you're convinced you're about to die. So here's the question for us. Today, in a world that ceaselessly celebrates forward motion, the relentless pursuit of more, faster, and bigger, would you dare to stop? Would you dare to turn around? Not out of a paralyzed fear, but out of a clear-eyed strategic vision. Would you take a step back because it's the only way to protect the people behind you and achieve the ultimate victory? Because courage isn't always a step forward. Sometimes it's knowing exactly when to take one back. Drop a comment below if this story shocked you, or if it made you rethink your own definition of bravery. And never ever forget Joe Johnson, the man who fought Hitler in reverse and won twice.